Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And yeah, this episode's just going to be a little weird. Not going to dance around it. Up until the last two acts, we're going to go to some pretty strange places. Wish I was more openly enthusiastic about the bunch and what we find, but hey, let's get on the pulse. So before we go any further, if you'd like to like and subscribe and share this, I would be extremely grateful. These sort of episodes do not get the traction that typical album reviews should. But now onto the matter at hand. We got 6 projects on the docket. Let's first go back and talk about from Vylet Pony, Can Opener's Notebook, Fish Whisper. So look, I had a lot to say about fandom works when I reviewed the last Vylet Pony album that I'm not especially interested in recapping. A lot surrounding the struggle to find stuff with the resonance to work outside of the fandom, and that meant that I was not just a little bit surprised to see my review get received reasonably well, but also see Vylet Pony's newest album drop less than a year later and land on my schedule with a similar avalanche of critical acclaim from spaces that, again, you might not expect. But hey, apparently I'm already knee-deep enough in this world that I was inclined to actually hear where the follow-up might go, and what we got is a project that tilts towards the more ethereal and lethargic tones of Vylet Pony's earlier work, while bringing in some of the more rock elements from Cutie Marks, with more anchoring the acoustic guitars and the synth pop progressions, and an even stronger Porter Robinson influence. It's less brash and trending towards the bratty hyperpop adolescence, and that's actually by design when you dig into the content, where this new OC is struggling to balance a real-life career and their artistic ambitions, which are feeling blocked under the weights of depression and adult responsibilities, given that their artistic drive was being scorned by parental figures and they actually do excel at their job. And while there's a part of me that's wondering if there are traces of autobiography behind all the ponies, the yaks, and the hippogriffs, I also can't deny that the slightly more mature dramatic stakes thematically, as a creative myself, did have a little bit more resonance than I expected, even if landing on the yearning, uncomplicated themes of create however your heart desires, well, felt a little basic, alongside slightly more restrained tones and compositions. And I say slightly because there are still some Vylet Pony issues that have persisted. It's once again too long, with some limited hooks and grooves. Songs will meander freely in between atmospheric interludes and multi-part pieces that really do not have much in the way of transitions or natural flow, especially later on the album, even if the strings sound pretty great. And there are synths on I Still Got Something to Teach You that reminds me a little bit of Ariane Lucassen of all things, and the oversaturated and compressed synths and electric guitars, they're more glitchy fuzz than tone. They blast over the highs and mids in the mix with little in the way of low-end impact. So yeah, basically a lot of the persistent issues I've had with Porter Robinson, where I get the impression that this overly twee and slightly precious approach, it'll probably have more resonance to those who have already bought into this sound palette of electronic pop or rock, or, in the fandom at large. And while it's absolutely more cohesive in the sound and more mature, it also doesn't quite have as many moments that leap off the page for better and worse, so I'm not sure it's gonna have the same punch for a lot of folks. So I'll reiterate what I said last time with a slight twist. Not really for me in terms of the sound, aesthetic, or fandom, but thematically and tonally, this worked a little bit better than I was expecting. And for those who actually align in both camps, I can see a lot of people really enjoying this. So yeah, it's worth giving a chance. Might surprise you. Next up from Alice Glass, Pray For. I'm going to start off with this submission. I never got into Crystal Castles. Even despite them being Canadian and getting a decent amount of critical acclaim, they were one of those acts that I never really felt compelled to check out. I just never got the buzz. So when that group disintegrated and the horrific allegations against Ethan Cath came out, I kind of felt like I dodged a bullet. But what about their former frontwoman, Alice Glass? Well, she put out an EP in 2017, and then had to deal with the lawsuits and the fallout from Cath, and then the past couple years took their toll on everyone, but now she's released on her own label a solo debut, produced by a former member of Health, So how is it? Well, alright, let's start with the elephant in the room, that being the content and the framing, which sparked a little bit of controversy, with more than a few songs seeming to be written from the perspective of an abusive partner, showcasing the tortured blur of gaslighting, isolation, Stockholm Syndrome, and breaking of personality and individuality that leads to some deep-seated despair and even dissociation. It actually gets pretty damn bleak on more than a couple songs, especially as there are tracks where she returns to the perspective of the abused person struggling for air beneath all of it before coming to the sick realization of everything that's been inflicted upon her by someone that she was reportedly trusting. And it ends with an ambiguous ending that I'm not sure is all that well realized. Now, on the one hand, you can definitely read a project like this as a nightmarish exploration and even reclamation of her past experiences within Crystal Castles. And by exploring every angle that translated into her art, she seizes some power and closure. Hell, with the juxtaposition of the sleek but fractured post-industrial and glitch pop that is strikingly catchy, she can showcase not just how she can deliver everything she was told she couldn't do in Crystal Castles, but also a stylism that allows the audience to touch this territory without breaking down. And if you didn't know the context of Alice Glass's past decade, you could easily just describe this as a concept album about abusive relationships, where the deflective glamour barely conceals something that's far uglier. It might use similar blunt language to Lingua Ignota's Caligula, but it's not trying to have as raw of an experience. But on the flip side, you can argue that also goes into dicey territory, especially in the execution. Alice Glass's delivery, between the synthesized hyperpop sweetness and some slightly rougher passages that can often feel numb or flat rather than more expressive, and a weird fit for some of the content, and when the writing feels often as bluntly sketched and direct as it is, on a shockingly short listen, it barely clocks over a half hour and more than a few songs feel abbreviated, it can feel like a bit of a reach on my part to pull for more nuanced context, and that leads to jarring moments on songs where the abuser's perspective that are just as bouncy and hook-driven as all the rest, and that's kind of a framing nightmare. It places a lot of the album in a difficult emotional space next to some of the pop elements, which for the most part I actually quite like, with the pulsating, rumbling grooves, the surprisingly well-balanced blast of glitch, and the haunted tunefulness on songs like Love is Violence and Witch Hunt, even if a fair few songs can feel a little bit abbreviated or a little bit derivative with their approach to this style of trap-inflected hyperpop, especially in some of the shuddering percussion. Overall, I think Alice Glass kinda needed to make this album, and I'll say it does carve out a distinctive niche within these subgenres. Hell, I would argue she succeeds on production and the hooks alone, but some shaky execution does keep this a step away from greatness. But if anything I described is up your alley, this is probably worth your time. Give it a chance. Check it out. But you know, while we're on the topic of glitch, from Black Dresses, Forget Your Own Face.
But they can't. I don't want to let you have it. I don't want to let you have it. I don't want to let you have it.
Count on Black Dresses to throw a curveball in terms of release strategy, even if they're now back on streaming. A midweek drop on Valentine's Day did surprise me with this, especially as the buzz felt strangely muted, and after having listened to it, yeah, I kinda get why. Because while Black Dresses' output has always been kind of hit and miss for me since the very beginning, this is a slice that might be more miss than hit. A big part is the production. Black Dresses at their best were able to harness these roiling, quasi-industrial passages that when blended could get some real low-end muscle, and while we do get a few clanking guitar passages, not only does the low end feel really lacking, there's a lot more emphasis on distorted pianos and the chaotic beeping but oddly flat synth passages that have patterns but feel like they just hang in the mix to clash. They kind of remind me a little of the spiraling glitch pop of Love and Affection, but considerably cleaner and a more spare mix, minus all the gurgling synth layers that don't really pass as blending and don't also succeed, which makes all the atonal side all the more exasperating, especially when there are songs like Doom Spiral and Nightwish that do have a sweeter side. They could go in that direction and choose not to. But then again, this is an album that sneers at any sense of structure. Songs like No Normal get close, but even that's goopy and underpowered, which I'd say is true for most of this if Adaruk wasn't howling her lungs out over all of it, full of all the tasters that let you know they could make something more tuneful, but are choosing not to and reveling in it, mostly as a giant middle finger to anyone who might try to commodify their sound or their identity. So the album kind of becomes difficult to criticize. The incoherent chaos, the lack of hooks, the messy production, the jumbled blend of depression and rage, it's not a bug, it's a feature. The contradictions are part of the point, and the explicit message that you would not want to be them going to this place and then having to live on the other side of it, even if it might bring success, and all that's not helping the deeper problems, which those appropriating the sounds will never properly understand, but they still paradoxically yearn to be loved and cherished and have fun within it, even if they are this weird. But at the same time, it might be an album that kind of succeeds too well. It's designed to provoke and alienate, smother the fan base who got on board for anything that's remotely accessible. Hi, but it also does so at the expense of some of their most potent textures and tunes that even the hyperpop crowd wouldn't all embrace anyway, to say nothing of the labels that are trying to cash in. And while the shotgun blast of shrieking and clashing synths a half step away from chiptune, they've definitely got impact. With less foundation in the grooves and more scattered writing, it just did not stick as much. I think I wound up appreciating the intent behind this more than I liked it, and even then, wouldn't put it close to their best. Give it a try if you want, but don't say I didn't warn you. Next up from Blood Incantation, Timewave Zero. So I've gone on the record that I'm not the biggest death metal fan, but there's been exceptions to the rule that I've mentioned in the past, one of the big ones being the Canadian band Tomb Mold for their classic, utterly filthy style of it. And a lot of friends of mine recommended that if I wanted an act with that sort of filthy edge, but a more tuneful, weird, space-themed vibe, I should check out Blood Incantation. I certainly saw the hype for this band explode in late 2019 with The Hidden History of the Human Race, and going back to that project now, yeah, I think I get it. In between the sharp melodic riffs, the roiling bass texture, the absolutely terrific drum work and production, and that pure crushing sizzle balanced out with touches of spacey psychedelia, I could probably get into it. So naturally for their follow-up, they put out a 40-minute ambient project with 2 extended 20-minute suites, and the fan base revolted. And yet, like when Loathe put out their excellent ambient album last year, not only does this make a certain amount of sense, given how I've come to embrace a lot more ambient music, I actually think this is pretty damn cool. The fullness of the waves of eerie, buzzy synth, with the wheedling fragments nestled amidst the spacious darkness, with all the textures that seem to call forth from the very earliest analog synthesizers, with distant flickers of percussion, and the third movements on each project the subtlest of mournful acoustic accents as the drones will growl and seethe. It's some pretty solid, moody work, with seamless transitions, potent melodies. The synth line in the second piece in particular feel a little bit more developed, and the sort of atmosphere that's designed to call to mind a lot of cosmic horror of a more retro variety. But that's also kind of all it does. Outside of maybe how the acoustics blend with the faded sample off the distant cymbal on the third movement of Ia, I would struggle to say that there's a textural or melodic moment that really jumped off the page for me, and I'd be remiss to say that Blood Incantation are remotely alone in modern ambient music using vintage synthesizers and creepy atmospheres to evoke this exact sort of sound. It makes most sense to view this as a cool side venture before Blood Incantation goes back to making death metal. It's not exactly great or revolutionary even in that, but it's again pretty cool nonetheless. If you like ambient music, give it a shot. Next up from Big K.R.I.T, Digital Roses Don't Die.
Don't need you anyway, yes, baggage. We had it, no status. Better off our separate ways.
I'm I'm a little bit shocked that so many folks want to hear me talk about this album in particular, especially given the buzz I've seen for this has been mixed at best. Now granted, there was a pretty noticeable fall off for KRIT Is Here, the 2019 album that couldn't help but feel like a letdown. So when he chooses to go for the neo-soul Andre 3000-esque genre pivot, it did have me worried that Big KRIT didn't always have the best feel for his strengths. And now that I've heard it, that might be a more accurate assessment than even I would like. And what's frustrating here is that I can hear what Big KRIT is trying to do, and I can respect it. Embrace a lot of his R&B and soul influences, heavily indebted to Prince or the Isley Brothers, or more accurately, the acts that would pivot off them, like Andre 3000's The Love Below, or pretty much any Janelle Monáe album, and then trace a 4-part love story with a loose framing device of the 4 elements. And given how much Big KRIT has tapped into this sound at his best, it might seem like a natural step to fully explore it, but my god, I don't think the execution is here at all. It has the feel of a longtime fan of these genres, trying to replicate the sounds and stylism he knows without capturing some of the deeper organic punch that might elevate the greats. And where that's most obvious is in the vocals. The rapping necessarily takes more of a backseat on the album, and that will become an issue when we get to the writing, but normally R&B and soul can compensate for it by having a layered personality or a big performance. And while Big KRIT has a good command of melody and can layer his backing vocals surprisingly well, he doesn't have anything close to the texture or flair as a singer compared to as a rapper, especially in his falsetto. The intensity is just not there. And when so many of the 17 songs on an album under 40 minutes feel so abbreviated, lacking in distinctive hooks, a lot of so-so compositions, they're not being saved by a great performance. And I can't say the writing that steps up to fill in the gaps really works either. A real surprise given that Big KRIT in the past has proven to be such a descriptive writer reveling in southern rap culture, but here with fewer words and less rapping, he defaults to a lot of broadly sketched cliches and the pretty spare relationship arc, or it gets weirdly corny like the fireworks going off on the end of Come Out to Play. It seems like he's got a lot more to say about everything around this girl, and after she leaves, more than about her directly. And maybe it's just a bad idea midway through the album to drop a song called Boring about how tedious he is in this relationship that might serve as unintentional meta commentary for a lot of the album's writing. And it clashes pretty hard with the album's thesis statement, where even if the relationship did not work by the very end, those digital roses, those snapshots and memories that are often more revealing even if you put on the filters, they're still worth chasing. They don't die. You'd think he'd be able to sell that instead of the weird hollowness of a lot of this project, or the inconsistent personality clash of songs like So Cool versus Would It Matter. And that traces to the production and the compositions, the former of which I will mostly defend. Yeah, the horns sound weedy, and most of the percussion sounds way rougher than it should. Big KRIT handled the majority of the production himself. He probably could have used more folks in the room just to refine things, especially going so far out of his comfort zone. But you know what? The fat synths and the bass lines do give this album some real groove, and I think the strings and acoustic guitars as a whole, they sound really solid and adding a lot of organic texture that this album really needs, which probably translates the best on Generational Weighed Down. Absolutely indebted to the classics, but that's not new, and Big KRIT does have good taste in them. But you know, for an artist who used to lean on a lot of grandiose bombast with an instinct for good melodic hooks to deliver compositions that feel this underwhelming or borderline unfinished, it's kind of shocking. And going smaller, we're not getting new deeper wells of intimacy or complexity or character. We're getting a revelation that there's just a lot less here. Again, on paper, this should have worked. And you know what? There are moments I think are okay. It's not a bad listen, but as an experiment, it's revealing of derivative mediocrity in the worst way possible. God, it was a letdown. I would skip it. And finally, from Conway the Machine, God Don't Make Mistakes.
I'm doing time, and do anybody care that I'm stressed? I don't come around, so I guess it's out of sight, out of mind.
At this point, it feels like the Griselda/Conway rollout train has reached the station so many times I'm losing count. Now, those of us who know have been aware of Conway the Machine for years now, not just from the flood of mixtapes, but also that he started churning out albums around 2019. Or did some of those count as does mixtapes too, it's tough to tell. Hell, I'm seeing labels advertise God Don't Make Mistakes as a major label debut with Shady, and I'm sorry, From King to a God, it wasn't his debut album on Empire, and I covered that 2 years ago. But alright, fine. My issue reviewing a lot of Griselda projects is that they can be consistently solid, a bit to a fault, and also a little one-dimensional. And you know what, Conway has shown a little bit more nuance, reading in between the lines, and with all the critical acclaim this was getting, I wanted to give it a proper shot, and I'm honestly wishing there was a little more I could say about this. Again, it's not that it's bad, not at all, as Conway's probably at his most introspective and vulnerable here, talking about childhood abuse, PTSD, depression, alcoholism, and how even despite his grimy come-up and success, it hasn't led to him being able to see his sons, one who died very young and one because of issues with the baby mom that he can't see and might be being raised by someone else. Most directly, the album speaks to when he got shot nearly in the head in 2012, which left him with Bell's palsy and partially paralyzed in the face. And you know what? He's still out here grinding, stacking cash, trying to get back to the community, not that the larger world seems to care. So the album's title becomes a mantra, a trudging, stoic, Job-like belief that every weary step and setback will hit him, but he's gonna persevere despite the increasing weight upon him, especially in the streets. And that can be pretty potent in creating a lot of mood and atmosphere, but it's more descriptive than deep or showing greater insight. And this is where I once again crash into the brick wall with Griselda projects that kind of holds me at a distance, and that the retro, eerily textured, sample-heavy, low-tempo boom bap that for some reason still has some slapdash mixing and mastering, it paints a scene, but it feels two-dimensional. Hell, it's been my issue with Rick Ross, and to some degree with Rock Marciano for years now. Now, strangely, it's not a problem that I have with Freddie Gibbs or Pusha T, but that to me is more due to more varied production and wordplay, slightly more expressive delivery, which again is not Conway's fault, but also embracing more melodic hooks every once in a while. And while there's a couple on this album, along with some good guest appearances from Jill Scott on the bassy Chanel Pearls, Lil Wayne dropping another really solid guest verse on Tear Gas, Benny the Butcher on John Woo Flick, who can compensate for West Side Gun doing whatever it is he does. Again, still not a fan of him. But also a really solid outro from Wallow 267 on Stressed, easily the best song here. None of these songs have the polish of a cut like Anza from a King to a God. I don't know, as much as I might have some distance from this, I absolutely recognize it as a deepening of Conway's feel and Griselda's formula, and that's leading into a lot of quality that's pretty obvious and is worth recommending. It just doesn't click with me as deeply or as emotionally as I would like. That's all. Maybe it'll grow on me. I hope it does. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Again, somehow I'm now actually back on schedule. That's really reassuring. But beyond that, hey, if you guys want to get albums on my schedule, or beyond just arguing with me in the comments down below, you can argue with me on Discord directly, or hell, just support the channel. Link to my Patreon is right over here. We're still growing the community. Happy to have you on board. If it's too much of an expense, don't worry about it. I'll be alright. But hey, you want to, the options available. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.